Everybody did not stand up when Tom Cotton walked in. I don't know if you're not used to that disrespect, but I'm going to now officially bang the gavel. You haven't started recording. Don't record that bad joke, please. Come on.
Senator Booker doesn't have any other kind of joke.
Definitely don't record that. I don't want to give Tom Cotton one up on me this early in the hearing. All right, we're officially gavelled in, and I just want to say good afternoon, everybody. It means a lot that everyone is here for an important hearing and this discussion, and I just want to give a lot of gratitude to folks making time out of their schedule to be a part of this. I want to welcome our witnesses, many of whom journeyed really far to be a part of this subcommittee hearing, and I'm also particularly grateful to have Tom Cotton as my ranking member and the work that his staff and he has done to make this hearing successful. We face a stark reality today. Our national correctional system, I think it's fair to say, is in crisis. The Bureau of Prisons is undergoing a well-documented staffing shortage. With 21% of correctional positions vacant, BOP has imposed more and more mandatory overtime, forcing officers to work 10, 12, 15, and we heard earlier today, 18-hour shifts. This disrupts their lives, makes it harder for them to find childcare or simply just to be with their families. The BOP has also relied on staff augmentation, pulling case managers, teachers, psychologists away from their work to perform duties they aren't often fully trained for. Our state's prisons are also functioning with dangerously low levels of staff in a way that I think we'll elucidate today. Over the last few years, we've seen an increase in the population of incarcerated individuals, which has now led to overcrowding. Correctional officers and their staffs are really struggling with this. These are some extraordinarily dedicated law enforcement Americans, yet they are overworked and underpaid and struggling with the resultant mental health challenges. I was stunned to find out how undercompensated they were when I sat down with Ms. Brandy Moore-White. It just did not compute to me how little we're paying them. And this, I want to say, leads to chronic stress. It doesn't just dissipate once officers leave the facility, it really follows them home. Devastatingly, it is estimated that 156 active duty correctional officers take their own lives each year. That's 3 individuals a week. The nation's correctional infrastructure is also in despair and more susceptible to extreme heat and cold, flooding, and other weather events. In Texas, more than 2/3 of the Texas prisons have no air conditioning, even after 10 incarcerated individuals have died from heat-related illness in the month-long heat wave back in 2011. This crisis has a profound human toll. In Georgia, it took 5 days for correctional staff to discover an incarcerated person's decomposing body after their death. In Missouri, despite multiple complaints and requests to see a dentist, an incarcerated individual pulled out his own teeth because he never received adequate dental care. Earlier today, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing about the Inspector General's disturbing findings that staff shortages were a contributor to deaths of incarcerated people in the Bureau of Prisons, not to mention the challenges and hardships placed upon our correctional officers. Our prisons have a weighty mandate to promote public safety by maintaining a humane and secure correctional environment and preparing incarcerated individuals to re-enter society. Plainly, it is not possible to accomplish this mandate with an overworked workforce laboring in unsafe and even undignified conditions. Look, the ranking member and I have areas of agreement and areas of not, but one thing he and I feel fiercely about, I've heard him speak about it, is this importance of public safety. Safe neighborhoods, safe communities, a safe country. If you look at our founding documents, so much of them, the establishment of our government was about keeping people safe, about public safety. Well, there's a direct connection between what happens in our prisons and the safety of our community, because 95% roughly of the people who go into prison come back out. An estimated 65% of the people incarcerated in the United States have a substance abuse disorder, but instead of providing services, we see that they're not getting basic medical care, which again has a direct correlation to how they behave outside of prison as well. The proven way to lower recidivism rates is to ensure access to medical care, including mental health and substance use treatment, which empower individuals through programming to ensure that incarcerated individuals are able to be successful when they're released. We even know there's a connection between incarcerated individuals being connected to their children and their families and their recidivism rates. What we need is common sense, evidence-based policies that promote proven methods to lower recidivism rates and empower people to succeed. Our correctional officers are public safety officials. They are critical to the safety of our nation. They are law enforcement individuals. Yet to deny them the resources or support we give to other members of law enforcement, or to have them disproportionately underpaid relative to the work of other law enforcement individuals, is not just disrespect, it actually undermines their mission of public safety. This crisis is a public safety issue and it is a moral issue. If you want to see the character of a country, don't look in our places of business, our fields of science and education alone. Look within our prisons. The condition of our prisons says so much about the character of who we are as a country. The people that work there, the people incarcerated there, do their conditions, do their work environment, do the conditions of their incarceration reflect the highest standards of a nation of our greatness? We should be setting the global example of incarceration and remediation, repair, and restoration. I look forward to this productive conversation with this extraordinary panel. I'm grateful again for everybody being that. And with that, I turn it over to the ranking member of this subcommittee, my colleague from Arkansas, Senator Tom Cotton.
Thank you, Senator Booker. This hearing touches on an important topic. I think we can all agree that our prisons are understaffed. In the federal system alone, we have about 40% of our prison correctional officer positions unfilled, even though Congress has already appropriated money to fill those positions. And crime is increasing in the country, in part because we've been too eager to empty out our prisons and let violent, dangerous criminals back into our communities far too early. The revolving door of poorly resourced prisons and increasingly weak sentences is worsening crime nationwide. We need to reverse that trend. In 1992, as the nation faced an epidemic of homicides and violent crime with people scared to leave their homes in some cities, then Attorney General Bill Barr released a report called The Case for More Incarceration. In that report, he argued that the failure to incarcerate leads to more crime and costs much more than spending on prisons. He was right then, and he's right now. And as Congress spent more on getting tougher on crime and setting up sufficient prison space, crime rates dropped dramatically. Unfortunately, too many would soon forget that success. You might even say that we were a victim of our success. A decade ago, when our prison population peaked, many argued that the high crime days of the 1990s were in the past, and we spend too much money on our prisons. If we had just let criminals out, they argued, we could save money on prisons. After all, why would we need prisons anymore if crime has decreased by so much? It's astounding that anyone ever believed that, but the idea that increased prison populations were somehow unconnected to a decline in crime was repeated over and over. The New York Times was especially fond of this line of argument. In August 1998, they ran an article entitled, "Prison Population Growing Although Crime Rate Drops." Almost exactly 2 years later, the same reporter at the New York Times published an article entitled, "Number in Prison Grows Despite Crime Reduction." And in 2004, that very same reporter published yet another article in the New York Times. The headline was, "Despite Drop in Crime, an Increase in Inmates." Now, maybe the New York Times was not getting its money's worth from that particular reporter, but eventually people started believing that prison populations were too high if crime rates weren't so bad. And over the past decade, the total state and federal prison population in the United States has dropped by more than 20%. In the federal system alone, it's decreased by 30%. And as prisons started to empty in 2014, not surprisingly, violent crime rates shot up nationwide by more than 10% in just 2 years. In big cities, the change has been even more dramatic, as reduced prison populations, combined with depolicing and so-called criminal justice reform measures to weaken penalties for committing crimes, were adopted. A study from Iowa State University researchers in the early 2000s ran the numbers to find out how much crime cost our society. Each armed robbery, every single one, cost society more than $335,000. The University of Chicago study similarly found that an armed robbery cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to society. These aren't just the immediate costs to the victim, like replacing stolen property and getting medical treatment after an assault, or paying for the funeral if someone dies. It also includes other costs of crime, such as higher insurance costs, shuttered businesses and laid off employees, behavioral changes from avoiding places and activities where you might become a crime victim, as well as the cost of increased police patrols in the high crime areas. The University of Chicago study put the total cost of crime in the United States at around $5.76 trillion per year, which means that the state and federal prison costs only about 1% of the total cost of crime. So we should be spending more, not less, because we have an under-incarceration problem in this country. We need to cut government spending in many areas, but criminal justice and national security are two of the main areas where government needs to spend, has to spend whatever it takes to keep our people safe. The title of today's hearing is not exactly what I would have chosen. It mentions assessing the toll of understaffed prisons on correctional officers and incarcerated persons. The right word there would be criminals or inmates. But one group we can't forget is the victims of those crimes. Fully funding and staffing our criminal justice system and our prison leads to less crime, and it creates an environment where criminals have their best shot at rehabilitation. So maybe today's hearing should have instead borrowed from that old report from Attorney General Barr and been titled "The Case for More Incarceration." We have a great panel of witnesses here, and I thank you all for your appearance. I look forward to hearing from you about how we can make our prisons safe, secure, and functional again.
All right, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses today. We will now introduce each of them, and then after the introductions, we're going to have you guys stand, raise your right hand, and we'll administer the oath. Our first witness is John E. Wetzel. Mr. Wetzel is the founder and board chair of Keystone Resource Justice Center, KRJC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing accessible and translatable data-driven solutions in the fields of corrections and criminal justice, a strategic management policy and research organization. KRJC seeks to elevate institutions and agencies to new heights to better serve communities. Mr. Wetzel served as a former Pennsylvania Secretary of Corrections from 2011 to 2021 under both Republican and Democratic governors and began his career as a correctional officer. Mr. Wetzel is a graduate of Bloomsburg University. Our next witness is Santia Nance, co-founder of Sisters in Prison Reform. Ms. Nance has been a criminal justice reform advocate in Virginia since 2019, after reconnecting with a loved one, her fiancé, Quadair Patterson. Focused on decarceration and second chances, she centers her work around oversight of the Virginia Department of Corrections and ending mandatory minimums in Virginia. Ms. Nance is also the editor of BrillianceBehindBars.com, a website that aims to humanize and uplift currently incarcerated individuals. Ms. Nance graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University with a BS in Mass Communication and is a senior advertising professional at a major agency. Next, we have Stephen B. Walker, National Wellness Director of One Voice United. Mr. Walker is a California resident, we'll forgive him for that, and lifelong activist in the area of child protection and crime prevention. Along with his role at One Voice United, he is also the Director of Governmental Affairs for the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. Mr. Walker previously worked within the California Youth Authority for 26 years as a youth correctional officer, and Senator Butler will have a moment for a rebuttal later on to that California comment. We also have two other witnesses that Ranking Member Senator Tom Cotton will introduce. I am pleased, though, to see that Brandy Moore White is here, sitting in the center square. The president of the Council of Prison Locals 33 on this panel, Ms. White, I want to thank you, and my staff actually wants to thank you for meeting with us a few weeks ago. It was enlightening to me, and even more so in the longer conversation you had with my team, and we're looking forward to your testimony. But for the other introductions, I'm going to turn it over to Ranking Member Tom Cotton to introduce the final witnesses.
Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce Brandy Moore White. Mrs. White is a highly qualified person to speak on prison staffing issues. She has been a career official at the Federal Bureau of Prisons for the past 2 decades. She's seen all of this firsthand and is still on the front lines today. She was elected last year as National President of the Council of Prison Locals, the union representing our federal corrections officers. She has previously served in leadership roles in the Council of Prison Locals for virtually her entire career. Maybe most importantly, she is from the great state of Arkansas, where she was born and raised and where she has spent the entirety of her corrections career. Brandy, thank you for joining us today and welcome. I'm also pleased to introduce Ralph Manguel. Mr. Manguel is the Nick O'Neill Fellow and Head of Research for Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research.
That's right next to New Jersey.
He's also an accomplished author and a contributing editor of City Journal, and his work has been featured in a wide array of major publications. He's well known to us. He's also testified several times for this subcommittee and other committees. He currently serves on the New York State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He holds a BA from City University of New York and a JD from DePaul University College of Law in Chicago. Ralph, welcome back, and thank you for joining us today.
Would the witnesses please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record show that all of them said I do, as if they were getting married. Get down, please. And appreciate your affirmative responses. You're each going to have 5 minutes for an opening statement. Mr. Wetzel, we'll start with you, please.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to once again talk about corrections, a field I spent my entire life doing. Part-time correctional officer at age 20 while at Bloomsburg University. 9 years as a correctional officer, counselor, head of the counseling department at a large county jail in Pennsylvania, head of the training academy, county warden, longest serving corrections secretary in the history of Pennsylvania. This field means everything to me. And, I can't imagine any of the senators in here have been in a hearing in the last 2 years that hasn't been about a crisis. I mean, it may be the most overused word in our vocabulary right now as it comes to the public sector, because everything's in crisis. But I think we need to use accurate language. We have a system on the brink of failure, and it's a system we all need. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, what you want out of your correction system, whether you think it's underused or overused. What we need, what our mandate is, what our covenant is, and as it relates to corrections, is that we do something to impact the trajectory of people who couldn't follow the rules. So, you don't, to many people's point, you don't get sent to a state prison or federal prison for jaywalking, all right? So implicit in that is that someone who comes to us has not complied with what we expect out of our citizenry, right? So if we want to make a good investment in our correction system, we should do something to take them off that trajectory, right? That's not happening anywhere. There may be a handful of systems, or maybe a handful of jails who are actually delivering this covenant of having people at least not get worse, if not come out better and less likely to commit a crime. We talk about public safety. I would argue it's actually broader. It's community safety. And our communities are less safe because of this crisis, if you want to use that term, what's this on the brink of failure correction system. I'm from Pennsylvania, born, raised, will never live in another state. And I will tell you that it's not just public safety in Pennsylvania. We spent a very nervous week in Pennsylvania because of a jail escape. It closed down major events right outside of Philadelphia. People who were not adjacent to the correction system in Pennsylvania are adjacent to the correction system. It's critical that we understand in America, we're all adjacent to the correction system. Nobody should feel good about the fact that we have National Guard members, people who, and listen, I spent 11 years, all but 11 years, 3 months short of 11 years, running the 6th biggest prison system in America, all right? I've worked a lot with the National Guard. We had floods, we have major events. That's what they're there for. They're covering the position of correctional officers at a time where people who aren't in this city are concerned about what's going on all over the country, all over the world. And we're using soldiers to man our jails and or prisons because we have inadequate staff. And the notion that we're going to push some idea to this field that's going to now work, where we've been pushing ideas forever, we have to think differently about this. And you know, we can look to history, and I love looking to history, especially when you're in this building. You know, 50 years ago, as a result of Attica, the National Institute of Corrections was created. Some of you may not have heard about that, and that's part of the indictment of the divestment and the intellectual development of this field. Listen, we're not going to fix problems if we don't have our correctional staff, who are remarkable, people who dedicate their lives. You don't even hear about them, you don't know about them. Heck, now you don't even wear your uniform home because you don't know what someone's going to say to you at the grocery store. All right, but they're dedicating their life, and they don't have a mechanism to develop professionally. Like, I would not be sitting here if the National Institute of Corrections did not offer what was called a clip course. For some of you old people, they used to have to send you a course, and you'd actually fill it out and send it back. It wasn't online. That's how I learned how to staff. All right, that's not available today. So the National Institute of Corrections, just to give you a little history, was invented came about after Attica. Right? And Attica was not at a federal prison, right? But Warren Burger, who was the Supreme Court justice at the time, or chief of the Supreme Court, as well as the Attorney General, others, were so bothered by what happened and what led to it that they felt like we needed a different approach. So they developed this National Institute of Corrections that was not actually part of the Bureau of Prisons, which it is now. It was adjacent. What it was designed to do was tap the best and brightest from corrections, right, to solve these problems, to think through, to advise you guys. So you actually made decisions on data. That used to happen, believe it or not. It used to happen that you'd make decisions based on actual data. You can't even get data on one of your biggest expenditures. You can't get accurate data. And you know, thank God I'm not the director of Bureau of Prisons. I have a world of respect for her stepping up in the system. But let me give you context as somebody sits in. She's been in the job maybe 2 years, year and a half. I'm sure for her it probably feels like 20 years. And she's asked questions about data. You have mainframe computers. You haven't updated, like you have old data systems. So you look at any other sector and you look at how you would resolve problems, you would use technology, you would use innovation. Look at the work of Clayton Christensen Institute of Disruptive Innovation. Look at the medical field. Look at poverty, attacking it by bringing technology to a field, right? By identifying individuals in the field, like incarcerated people, like correctional officers that are ignored by the market, right? There's no research and development. You don't see patents flying out at how we address this issue.
I'm going to hold you to 5 minutes.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. It's a real 5 minutes, not a senatorial 5 minutes.
Yep. Sorry.
No worries. No, we really appreciate it. We're looking forward to hearing more of your testimony, and it's an insightful presentation. I'm going to move on to Ms. Nance and for her actual 5 minutes.
Don't worry, I'll give you 5 minutes. Chair Booker, Ranking Member Senator Cotton, and members of the subcommittee, thank y'all for having me today. My name is Santia Nance. I'm the mother of a middle schooler, a Virginia voter, vice president of an advertising company, and fiance to Quadair Patterson, who has served 15 years on a 20-year sentence. Quadair made some poor decisions when he was a young adult, only 20 years old, and he was homeless. He takes full responsibility for the decisions that led to his current incarceration, but spending all of his 20s and half of his 30s in prison, he's made the most of his time in prison and seized every opportunity to prepare for his successful reentry. He received his GED in 2012 and is taking college courses through Ohio University and studying to be a paralegal. He has a trade in brick masonry and assists with reentry efforts and mentorship through Brilliance Behind Bars. Quadair is housed at Lawrenceville Correctional Center, which has been facing a lot of staffing shortages since at least 2018. And the Virginia Department of Corrections has estimated that they need a number, almost 100 correctional officers. While a partnership during incarceration is already hard enough for me and my family, short staffing there has impacted us tremendously. Quadair was diagnosed with glaucoma in 2012, and he needs his eye drop medication called Lanaprost. Without this medication, it's not only difficult for him to do everyday tasks, but to keep up with his coursework and his studies. Quadair has filed multiple grievances in the past couple years and requests to see the eye doctor, and this eye doctor only comes to the facility once a month, but he's only been met with, "You're on the waiting list." So it's just been ridiculously hard to get him in front of the eye doctor to get his prescription renewed. Because of short staffing, he's seen how firsthand how this has affected services and programming necessary for rehabilitation. For example, religious gatherings like church on Sunday, they get canceled at the last minute. Now, only one correctional officer runs the gym instead of 4, so music, anger management, substance abuse programming, those have all been interrupted, causing difficulty to encourage rehabilitation for the people at Lawrenceville. While prison does require physical separation, we stay in contact through visitation a couple times a month, phone all day when we can, and email when we can. But short staffing has interfered with our ability to maintain our family bond. My visits on January 28th and February 4th of this year were canceled due to staffing concerns. And my recent 2-hour visit on February 18th was cut short by 50 minutes due to the wait time of the long line of visitors. And it was staffed by only one correctional officer, where there should have been 4 or 5 in the office processing us. But she was the only one who knew how to do all 5 jobs and was willing to step up. Whether there are lockdowns in the prison or an extended count time due to lack of employees to cover shifts, I suffer not knowing the reason why Quadair is not calling. I haven't heard from him since Sunday of this week, and I often fear the worst when I'm unable to reach anybody at Lawrenceville. There's a trend of these events that happen during holidays, bad weather, and evenings, as people might be calling out of work. Quadair knows that he has to be held accountable for the mistakes he made, but the issues caused by understaffing go well beyond affecting those behind the prison walls. It punishes me and my son as well. After reconnecting with Quadair 6 years ago, I co-founded an organization called Sisters in Prison Reform. Our mission and purpose is to bring humanization to those behind the walls and collaborate with Virginia's lawmakers. Through this work and my personal experience, I believe that the answer to this crisis, if we're going to use that word, to identify those who have received harsh sentences and have rehabilitated themselves, and to release those who have proven they're ready to come home and do not pose a public safety risk. Like many others in Virginia, Quadair's sentence includes 13 years of mandatory time. But this harsh mandatory sentence was not necessary to protect the public or to prepare Quadair to re-enter society. Quadair is rehabilitated and ready to join our communities. There are many mechanisms to identify what rehabilitation looks like: good behavioral records while in prison, educational milestones, safe environments to go home to, secure jobs, and the list goes on. There are people like Quadair, my fiance, that our state and federal tax dollars are wasting money on when these incarcerated people could be home and paying taxes and giving back to their communities. Reducing the population would lessen the burden of the officers and allow them to maintain a manageable environment that focuses on those who still need rehabilitation. Thank you for your time and for the opportunity to share my story today.
Thank you, Ms. Nance. Ms. Moore-White.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, members of the subcommittee, and distinguished guests. I want to sincerely thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to present the perspective of our federal prison system and from the professional, hardworking men and women of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. For far too long, this conversation has been missing a key element. That's the professional law enforcement officers who have dedicated their lives to protecting their coworkers and communities and safely housing inmates. The Council of Prison Locals represents nearly 30,000 correctional professionals across the country in 121 federal prisons. These professional law enforcement officers who work tirelessly in some of the most violent, self-contained cities in the country keep us all safe from some of the world's most dangerous human beings. Today, I would like to discuss our primary concerns, which are the current critical staffing levels and pay structure within the Bureau of Prisons, both of which must be addressed urgently. Staffing levels in the Bureau of Prisons have reached alarming levels. Over the past 7 years, the authorized positions within the Bureau have decreased from 43,369 to the current count of 34,470 staff members. This reduction of nearly 8,900 staff members not only compromises the safety and security of both staff and inmates, but it also raises major concern and hinders our ability to effectively carry out the Bureau's mission and rehabilitate and reintegrate. The impact of these staffing cuts is particularly evident among our correctional officers. Despite the President's request and subsequent legislation, the number of correctional officer positions has drastically fallen short of what has been appropriated by Congress. At the close of 2023, we had approximately 12,300 correctional officers, which is more than 8,000 less, or 40% below, of the appropriated number of 20,446 officers. This number follows a year of hiring initiatives enacted by our agency. Within the current staffing levels, the Bureau of Prison, the First Step Act cannot be successfully enacted. Staff used for programming are often pulled from their positions and used to backfill shortages of correctional officers. Augmentation reduces inmate access to recidivism-reducing activities like programming, recreation, and educational initiatives. Additionally, because of the lack of staffing, correctional officers are forced to do mandatory overtime. Overtime officers are frequently mandated at the last minute to stay an additional 8+ hours, often several times a week. This diminishes skills and awareness, it reduces acuity, and causes general fatigue, which greatly hinders supervision. Augmentation and mandatory overtime have become the norm. This detracts from our programming, it compromises the safety and security of the institutions, but it also greatly affects the mental health and well-being of our employees. The union believes that the staffing crisis can only be resolved by addressing our insufficient pay band issues. The current pay structure within the Bureau is significantly lower than that of other federal law enforcement agencies, including the U.S. Marshals, Immigration and Customs, and Border Patrol. The Bureau's pay scale is non-competitive with state and local law enforcement and even the private sector market. Without addressing these pay disparities, the Bureau will continue to struggle and attract and retain employees. The Bureau must be required to increase the pay bands to correct the staffing crisis. Because the Bureau is unable to solve its biggest problem, it now requires the direct intervention of the administration, OPM, and the legislative authority of Congress to immediately correct. The Council of Prison Locals has worked diligently with members of Congress to properly fund the Federal Bureau of Prisons. However, even with additional funding, there continues to be a decline in correctional officers. Congress must now demand oversight and accountability. The Bureau of Prisons staffing has graduated from a crisis to a catastrophe with real human consequence. The Bureau must use the funding that has been appropriated to fully hire the correctional officers needed to safely house incarcerated inmates. In order to achieve this, efforts must be made to raise the pay bands and make our federal law enforcement officers competitive with other law enforcement agencies. Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my formal statement, and I truly look forward to answering any of your questions and providing additional insight.
I'm grateful for your testimony. Mr. Walker.
Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and esteemed. That would help, wouldn't it? Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and esteemed members of the committee, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Stephen Walker. I am a representative of One Voice United, a national organization advocating for the welfare of correctional officers and other frontline staff and ensuring that our expertise and perspectives are included in the national debate around criminal justice reform. Before One Voice, I served as a youth correctional officer for 35 years in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations, and currently serve as the Director of Correctional Health for the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. Today, I sit before you to address the existential staffing crisis in America's prisons and jails in hopes of advancing a nationally sanctioned dialogue. This crisis has no borders, is not one state's issue, and cannot be solved by a single department or entity. It is a systemic issue and impacts every aspect of corrections by asking staff to do more with less and often resulting in excessive work hours and multiple mandated shifts, leading to increased burnout, less job satisfaction, and an inability to perform everyday security and rehabilitative functions. We are in full support of the position Ms. Moore-White offered on augmentation. From experience, I can tell you that it is not enough to just find a warm body to fill a vacant position. To be a competent and professional correctional officer takes time, supervision, and training, not to mention the fact that augmentation takes key personnel and nurses, teachers, and administrators out of their primary functions without replacement of the services lost. For staff, personnel shortages lead to diminished observational skills, less intelligence gathering, overtime surges, slow response, and strained family relationships and collective wellness. In fact, multiple studies indicate that correctional officers suffer from PTSD, depression, suicide, heart disease, and shortened lifespan, and other physical and psychological ailments at a rate well above the general public. For those in our care, personnel shortages mean programs are slashed, visits are reduced, time on lockdown is increased, and the patience of everyone behind the walls wears thin. The ratio often surpasses 60-1, especially in yards and chow halls, and unpredictable staffing patterns force policy-mandated prioritization of institutional safety, which limits programming, rehabilitative services, which are essential for promoting positive behavior and reducing recidivism. Addressing this staffing crisis is crucial for creating a secure environment for both staff and incarcerated individuals. To combat this reality, well-meaning attempts are being initiated by agencies in various states by lowering entrance requirements for new recruits, shortening academy times, and offering signing bonuses, none of which has successfully addressed this crisis to scale of lasting impact. Retaining staff is equally important, and we must transform employment conditions by moving beyond the traditional top-down paramilitary administrative model. Research and studies done on retention show overwhelmingly that it is not the incarcerated that drive good employees away. It is a lack of communication, recognition, and transparency, along with outdated and uninformed policies. The expectation and demands of today's corrections have outgrown the systemic administrative model, leading to a profession where staff feel devalued and expendable. This has resulted in a growing reluctance among officers to silently endure this challenge, highlighting a clear misalignment between the needs and values of new officers and the prevailing culture and operations of corrections. Fortunately, there are remedies and actions that can be taken to address these issues, but they require thoughtful planning and input from all stakeholders. Addressing this crisis requires appealing to potential employees by valuing their goals, integrating them into a respected team from day one, providing empirical training, better pay, lower healthcare costs, holistic wellness programs, and attractive incentives such as educational benefits, pensions, and reducing vesting periods. In concluding, without achieving these objectives and including the voices and experiences of those who will be impacted by their success or failure, true rehabilitation is unrealistic, and prisons will continue to fall short of their primary mission of creating a safe and humane atmosphere for successful reentry back into society. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mangual, and you've been so generous because you testify often. Am I pronouncing that well, right? Mangual?
Mangual, yeah.
Mangual.
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 Close enough.
Thank you. I had a phonetic that's wrong. It says M-A-I-N. Mangual. Mangual.
Mangual.
Mangual. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and other members of this distinguished body, I'd like to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to offer remarks on this important topic. As was said earlier today, the first duty of any government, whether local, state, or federal, is to keep its people and their property secure. And one of the primary ways in which governments provide that security is through criminal justice systems. The police are the most visible elements of these systems, but they're certainly not the only ones. Indeed, their effectiveness depends in large part on other criminal justice actors. Prosecutors still need to prosecute, judges still need to adjudicate and sentence, and crucially, correctional institutions need to secure and hopefully better the prisoners that they take in. Effectively managing a correctional population, however, requires investment. Unfortunately, we have seen throughout this country an unwillingness to adequately invest in corrections as decarceration, the pursuit of correctional population declines, has become both a policy priority in its own right and also the preferred means of alleviating the pressures on correction systems created by staffing shortages, facility maintenance costs, growth, and overcrowding. I'd like to use the remainder of my time to make 3 points. First, decarceration, whether pursued as a public policy good unto itself or as a means of cost saving, is not a cost-free endeavor. Second, the potential cost-saving effects of decarceration, at least in the short and intermediate terms, are more limited than they might appear to be based on average cost per inmate figures. And third, making the necessary investments in our criminal justice system to address issues like understaffing, overcrowding, and security concerns will not only help improve correctional outcomes, but it will keep the government out of a position in which budget constraints require it to make choices that ultimately harm public safety. On the first point, most of the public safety risk associated with any significant scale decarceration effort derives from the loss of incapacitation benefits. Those are the beneficial effects of an active offender's removal from society, which come in the form of crimes not committed as a result of that offender being behind bars. One study recently found that for the period of 1991 to 2004, quote, each additional prison year served prevented approximately 8 index crimes, and that's an estimate that's based on both federal and state prisoner populations. Now, the federal prison population consists of inmates who, on average, pose a somewhat lower risk of recidivism, but the risk of recidivism posed by federal offenders is far from zero. An analysis of more than 25,000 offenders released in 2005 found that just under 50% were rearrested over an 8-year observation period. Now, some might be tempted to argue that the recidivism data of those released pursuant to the First Step Act, or FSA, strengthens the case for decarceration, but those data do just the opposite. While it's true that only about 12% of FSA beneficiaries have recidivated according to the April 2023 annual report, the recidivism data for FSA beneficiaries nevertheless illustrates just how little low-hanging fruit there is in the federal population. According to that report, nearly 9 in 10, or 88.3% of the more than 24,000 releasees who had a risk assessment done were rated minimum risk or low risk. Moreover, the bulk of those offenders, more than 20,000 of them, in fact, had only been released for a year prior to that report's publication, meaning that their lack of rearrest may simply be a function of the short observation period. The much larger state prison population, more than 2/3 of which is in primarily for a violent or weapons offense, poses an even more pronounced risk of recidivism, with 9 and 10-year recidivism rates for releasees breaking 80%. So while it's certainly the case that some small subset of the country's prison population consists of inmates whose incarceration no longer serves a legitimate penological end, the vast majority of prisoners in the U.S., both state and federal, pose a significant risk of reoffending. As for the second point, the cost savings potential of decarceration efforts may not be what they seem. It's often noted that it costs an average of $42,000 a year to incarcerate a single federal prison inmate. However, the problem with using this figure is that it might give you the impression that you save $42,000 if you incarcerate one fewer inmate. But the lion's share of the average cost per inmate is a function of fixed costs. The marginal cost per inmate tends to be a much lower figure, albeit more difficult to calculate. Moreover, the potential savings associated with decarceration are also going to be eaten into by the costs associated with the additional crimes that might occur as a result. Indeed, the estimated annual cost of crime in the U.S. is in the trillions, and a single homicide has been estimated to cost nearly $9 million, while an assault can carry a societal price tag of more than $107,000. Third, and finally, despite the numbers that can be thrown around with regard to the cost of doing criminal justice in the United States, it remains the case that our criminal justice system is underfunded and in need of an upgrade. That includes staffing. It is almost certainly the case that there are measures on which the federal and state correctional authorities can perform better, but it is also likely the case that boosting performance and improving outcomes will depend on the degree to which Congress and state legislatures are willing to direct resources to these institutions in order to facilitate such improvement. And that is a political choice, one with dire consequences for those inside and ultimately outside of our nation's prison populations. We can and should choose wisely. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Mongwell, thank you very much for that testimony. I appreciate that. And if there's no objection, I'm going to save my questions for the end and go straight to Senator Butler for her California rebuttal.
It's nothing like coming to a hearing with Senator Booker in the chair. Thank you, sir, for your continued generosity. Senator Cotton, bless you for serving with Senator Booker. And thank you to the witnesses and all of you. I am assuming that a number of you are correctional officers yourself. And I appreciate you being here and being present in the work that you do. A couple of questions, and I'm going to take the privilege of starting with my California resident, Mr. Walker. Good to see you again. I was excited to hear that you were coming to today's panel because I know you as an advocate for officers, and it is in our working together that I have really seen your heart and indeed your legacy. Your family's legacy for doing this work. Not just you, but as I understand, your father and your son. 3 generations in your family have contributed your time and talent to public service in this way, and we're grateful. Can you talk about the evolution of the profession and the catastrophe or crisis or fill in the blank of what it is that officers are experiencing today, just from the lens of that generational engagement?
Thank you, Senator. It is a pleasure to see you again. Yes, my family we've literally given our lives to this occupation. And unfortunately, it's taken more from us than is advertised your commitment is supposed to be. And it's not just my family, it's every one of these people sitting behind me. It's taking from them silently. And as far as the evolution of it, it's hard to say because I started in the 80s. Where we were legitimately tasked with rehabilitation, and we had the capacity to do that. We had the staffing for it, we had the resources for it, and the population was managed. And we went through that tough on crime era where we literally went from having single bunked individuals to triple bunked to unconventional sleeping arrangements, and that ability of rehabilitation, that ability of engagement, of socializing to understand what the needs were of the individuals we were tasked with supervising and caring for, went out the window. Unfortunately, my father didn't do a good job of telling me what the job was, and I came into the agency. I didn't communicate with my family what I was enduring, and my son came into the agency. And it cost him his life. We cannot keep operating the way we are. It is literally killing people slowly. We are poisoning ourselves every time we walk back into and every time we introduce someone to this environment in the absence of having the services, resource, and personnel to adequately manage the new mission, because society is asking for something different, and we're still operating off of an antiquated model of incarceration. It's the default. It's what we know best. Helping people, serving people is the challenge that I think that society and this body actually wants to see. They want to see people return to their communities better.
Yeah.
And if not, then we keep them.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, that response was worth my entire 5 minutes.
I'm sorry.
No, don't. Your family has given more than 5 minutes worth. And so I appreciate you sharing that. I would love to, Mr. Chairman, submit questions to the panel after the hearing.
Of course, and before I defer to the ranking member, Mr. Walker, I think I could speak for the whole entire subcommittee about our grief and our sorrow about your son's loss. The story of dedication of your family through generations in and of itself is extraordinary, but the circumstances of your son's death should not have happened, and we're grateful for you sharing that what has got to be unimaginable grief with this committee, so thank you. And I'll now defer to the ranking member, Tom Cotton.
Mr. Walker, I also express my condolences, and your family story is an important reminder for many people that, like military service, law enforcement is often a family affair in this country, and some families bear the brunt of that service to keep our country and our people safe. Ms. White, this morning, the director of the Bureau of Prisons testified in front of the full committee. She said that the Bureau has only 14,899 correctional officer slots. Those slots are 82% filled. In other words, the Bureau has approximately 12,300 correctional officers today. Is she correct in your understanding that the Bureau is nearly fully staffed?
No, sir.
Could you explain a little bit more why?
Sure. So I have one of her staffing reports in front of me. The agency is very protective of their numbers, as you guys have seen in many hearings. As of pay period 26, which was December 30th, we are showing 12,306 officers. Typically, I have to reach out to 121 institutions and get their staffing reports to compile those to get those numbers. But that's the number I show, and that's why I testified to those numbers. I did hear she testified this morning to 14,000 and some change, and I have a hard time believing that since December 30th, she has brought on over 2,000 officers.
Yeah. As it happens, I just went on their website since the hearing, and I looked up any potential openings, and they list openings, and it says location, prisons nationwide, and the number of openings is many vacancies.
Correct.
Many is capitalized, many vacancies. To what I think I'll submit that screenshot for the record, Mr. Chairman. While I'm at that,
That might be the first time in Senate history a screenshot has been submitted, but no objection.
Okay. And I think what happened this morning is that the director was speaking only, if you might say, about frontline correctional officers, excluding things like lieutenants or supervisory correctional officers. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir.
So it would be as if the Secretary of the Army gave you only the number of privates he had, not the number of NCOs and officers he had. Is that right?
Right. So many times we disagree on numbers, and again, they're not very public with their numbers, but oftentimes when I've discussed with them, there is a series, it's a 007, and there's other individuals that are included in that series, counselors, lieutenants, other individuals that are not primary correctional officers. So I don't know if that's the confusion or the difference in the numbers, but according to my records, we have right around 12,000 officers.
And you believe that the number of Bureau of Prison Correctional officers over the last year has decreased, not increased, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Monguel, the total federal and state prison population has declined by more than 20% since it peaked in 2013. Has violent crime increased or decreased as the prison population declined?
It's gone up significantly.
That's what I thought. Would you say that there's been at least some inmates in federal and state prisons who don't necessarily need to be there, at least maybe not as long as they are, at least some?
Sure, but I think it's also important to recognize that there is a significant number of individuals on the street today who need to be inmates.
Well, my next question, at least some criminals out on the streets who maybe should be in prisons today?
Quite a few more.
And which one is higher, the number of people in prison who maybe don't need to be there and the number of people on the streets who maybe do need to be in prison?
I would say certainly it's the number of people on the street who do need to be in prison, and one indicator of that is just the clearance rate numbers in this country. If you look at the 8 index felonies that are consistently tracked by the federal government, the clearance rate only hovers at about 50% for the violent ones and about 20% for the nonviolent ones, which indicates that the vast majority of the crime, the serious felony crime, goes unanswered for. So that in and of itself should tell you.
And isn't it the case that the vast majority of crimes are committed by a very small percentage of the population?
That's exactly right. I mean, the bulk of our crime problem is and has long been driven by very, very active, overactive offenders. And so you can actually get a lot of bang for your buck by, targeting carceral resources appropriately.
And I think you testified earlier that something like 8 crimes are avoided for every person in prison?
Per year, yeah. And that's a pretty conservative estimate because it's an estimate derived from official crime reports. And one of the other things that we know is that most crime that occurs in this country does not get reported, and that's evidenced by the consistent disparity between the National Crime Victimization Survey and UCR.
Okay. My time's almost up. Mr. Chairman, one more administrative matter. I have a letter dated yesterday from the major county sheriffs of America urging Congress to prioritize legislation that supports the recruitment and retention of law enforcement in all areas, to include corrections. Of course, the county sheriffs also have an important correctional role to play as they run our county jails as well. I ask for consent that this letter be added to the hearing record.
I will add it with considerable alacrity. Is that it?
That is all.
I'm going to now defer to Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry I had to step out for a minute. I had a federal agency in my office with a project in Rhode Island that needed a little attention, and that's what we do. I'm delighted that you all are here. Thank you very much. My Rhode Island experience has been that we've been pretty successful at being able to reduce prison populations. I think the numbers are 23% reduction from 2008 to 2016, and another 34% from 2017 through 2021. A lot of that has been diverting people away at early stages. I helped launch the drug court when I was Attorney General. We also now have a very well-run veterans court that helps, again, divert people away from the criminal justice system in a way that is very effective. And if you've ever been to what they call a veterans court graduation and compared that to the day of a district court conviction, in one case, the guy's going out the back door in manacles and the family's crying, and in the other case, he's coming back to a cheering family and they're balloons. And they've had very, very, very good results with reduced reoffending and reincarceration. And we're launching a mental health court as well to try to manage better the interaction between the mental health system and the criminal justice system. So we have a relatively small population, so it helps because There's quite a lot of direct hands-on care in all of this. But I do want to express my appreciation to the Rhode Island Brotherhood of Correctional Officers, who say that they walk the toughest beat in the state. Mr. Wetzel, I'm sure you appreciate that. But we've worked on earned time credits. We've reduced mandatory sentencing. We've had the diversion programs that I mentioned, apart from just the Attorney General's own regular diversion. And it's had that result, and it's been really essential to do that. Mrs. White, I'm sorry about these results with the First Step Act. I was the author of the reentry part of the First Step Act, along with my colleague Senator Cornyn on this committee. And it's frustrating that an act that bode so well and has produced quite good results and has reduced reoffending and reincarceration and has prepared people better for reentry, particularly set them up to deal better with addiction issues, can't get the attention it needs to succeed because of all these multiple demands on the staff to try to get there. So if there are specific recommendations that you have from your close-up perch as to things we should be poking at the Bureau over, or things that we should be particularly focused on funding, I guess my point here is that I have seen a lot of stuff work in Rhode Island to dramatically reduce prison populations and make it the difficult job of the Brotherhood of Correctional Officers safer and easier. And to me, the First Step Act was an effort to take some of those lessons and move them into the federal system. So it's, as I said, it's irritating and frustrating that we are where we are on that. So any comments that you have, and if you want to think about it and get back to me with a more precise list,
Sure.
Please take it also as a question for the record.
Absolutely. I can definitely speak on, we did testify, one of my board members on the committee for First Step Act, and as we testified, we do think it's a phenomenal program, and I think if we can get the staffing that we need, it would be a much more successful program in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There is more detailed stuff that I will submit to your office.
Okay. I'm assuming that there are sort of mandatory staffing requirements at various posts in the prison that require people to be pulled off to go and hit those mandatory posting requirements. Is that generally the problem?
So we do what we call augmentation, and so anyone who works, say, education, health services, anywhere, if there is a vacancy, and we start our day, every day in almost every prison with vacancies for the correctional roster, you get pulled or augmented to a correctional officer post. And so that's part of the issue, and that's why I said staffing. If we can get our staffing to where it needs to be, those individuals would not have to be pulled off at their post, and they could provide the class or the training or the programming or whatever that they should be doing instead of being a correctional officer for the day.
Yeah, okay. Well, my time's up. Chairman, thank you for the hearing. Thank you to this distinguished panel, and Mr. Wetzel, thank you for your service.
Senator Whitehouse, I'm grateful. I'm told by my staff the order of appearance, and this order will go into Senator Ossoff, Senator Padilla, and no disrespect to the two aforementioned gentlemen, the best for last, Senator Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing us together. Grateful also to Senator Cotton for supporting this hearing, and thank you to our panelists for your expertise and experience. Mrs. White, as you know, Senator Braun, Chair Durbin, and I have introduced bipartisan legislation to overhaul federal prison oversight and strengthen security at federal prisons. And the purpose of this bill is to help identify and address threats to the safety and welfare of both incarcerated people and the thousands of correctional officers and others who work in our federal prisons every day, and that's the Federal Prison Oversight Act. Mrs. White, the Council of Prison Locals, which represents more than 30,000 correctional officers, worked with us to develop this legislation and has endorsed the legislation. Can you speak to the committee about why correctional officers support our bill and what it would mean for your members who are working in federal prisons every day?
Sure. So as you said, we have been in support, and we have worked really hard to help get this. We have For years, the Council of Prison Locals, the union, has gone to bat and asked for additional funding. For years, we thought funding was our only issue. If we could get more money, we could fix the problems. And the union was very successful in doing so, but over the years, we have come to know that funding is not the issue. Sometimes it might be an oversight issue of where the funding is going. So we have been strategic in where we asked for funding the last couple of years. This year, we probably will be a little even more strategic, but as I said in my opening and in the written statement, we welcome any oversight. We need accountability. We need help. The Bureau, I think, is the second largest in DOJ budget, and we're not sure where all of that money is going. And so any oversight from anyone, I think, would be super helpful.
Well, I'm grateful to you and your organization for helping us to develop this legislation and for the advocacy of the correctional officers across the country who are urging Congress to pass it. It's a bipartisan bill aimed at improving oversight within BOP, strengthening the security of federal prisons. It's got strong support from the Council of Prison Locals, strong support from reform advocates, and look forward to working with you to continue to urge it across the finish line here in the Senate and in the House. Mr. Wetzel, you, I believe, are also familiar with the legislation. And based upon your extensive experience working in corrections, what impact do you believe it would have on conditions and safety in federal prisons, both for incarcerated people and staff?
It's essential. I don't see how you make progress in the federal system without knowing. You can't even lay out a data-driven or problem statement because you don't have enough information. The very essence of fixing a problem is being able to define it and come up with a problem statement. Independent oversight and that kind of forced transparency, real time on a regular basis is essential to moving the Bureau of Prisons forward and any agency forward.
Well, I appreciate your input and your support for the legislation as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the impact of understaffing on some of these specific safety issues. I led a PSI investigation a couple years ago, found that female inmates in more than 2/3 of federal prisons that housed female inmates had faced sexual abuse from BOP employees. How do chronic understaffing issues lead to a higher incidence of abuse? And again, just to clarify, make sure I presented the statistic correctly, in 2/3 of federal prisons that housed female inmates faced sexual abuse from BOP employees. How is this linked to understaffing?
Yeah, I think assault by a staff member, assault by another incarcerated person, name any bad event, and the very essence of stopping bad events is supervision. And you design facilities and you design them with a staffing plan. And so when you have half the people to do that staffing plan, and you have let's say you have 100 housing units and you have 50 people to cover them, there's no one on those housing units. And at some point, the human beings on those housing units who are locked in cells have to come out of those cells. They have to be fed. They have to get medication. There's a series of things that happen. Without people, it doesn't happen. And so when you get people out and there's nobody there, there may be some folks who are among them who want to do harm to them. So it undermines supervision, and these staffing shortages filter the whole way up. One of the things that I think is a really good illustration for you of how staffing impacts other things is we heard about BOP issuing a memo about something. I forget what it was, but the memo was issued from the director, and this is pre-Collette, and you observed at the IG observed at several prisons that it wasn't happening, right? That communication has to happen through people. You're talking about a 40% vacancy rate. I mean, these guys need roller skates. I mean, if you've done just a round in a federal prison, right? You think you can just walk through and not get stopped by someone, or if something's going on? I mean, it's wide open for what can happen when you have half the people you need. There's no kiosks in corrections. It doesn't work like that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wetzel, and thank you. And one thing that's become very clear to me through the oversight that I've worked on these issues is a shocking statistic like that. It's not an indictment of the overall BOP workforce. The overwhelming majority of correctional officers are hardworking public servants who try to do the right thing every day. Failures by management, failures at headquarters, failures at high levels of the federal government have put these teams in impossible circumstances. And the Federal Prison Oversight Act, a bipartisan bill with strong support across the board, is vital to addressing these issues. Thank you all for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for your not just questions in this hearing, but for your work on these issues as a senator and even before, and someone else who's worked on these issues for a lot of his career. Senator Padilla, you're up for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the panelists, especially my friend Stephen Walker, for being here today. I'll come back to you in a minute. But a lot of the discussion I've tracked has dealt with the consequences of the staffing shortages that has brought us to this point. My first question is in the spirit of a little bit of the problem solving. For years we know that BOP has been experiencing a staffing crisis with the consequences both for correction staff as well as incarcerated individuals. And I know that there's officers from California facilities who regularly contact my office sharing what's going on in facilities throughout the state and sharing the frustrations that they face. So my question is actually for Mrs. White. What are the greatest barriers in your opinion, not just to recruitment and not just to retention, but also to morale of correctional staff, and what recommendations you have for how they can be addressed? You already started touching on it. It's more than just funding. So
Correct. So funding, in my opinion, is the biggest. Compared to Border Patrol or ICE, our officers make an average of $37,000 a year less. That in itself would be a morale booster to up their pay. But when we can address the pay issue and bring more staff on board. I started 20 years ago, and it was a great place to work. We had enough staff. We had enough staff to do the vast majority of the duties that we needed to do. And that in itself, having people, we had, it was more like a family than a coworker. We had each other's back. We supported each other. If I was running behind, my coworker would help. We don't have that now because people are so frustrated. If I call in sick, it leaves someone to get mandated. And then they're angry with me. It doesn't matter if I have a sick child or anything like that. So I think the staffing, the effect it's had on the morale is huge. So getting the staffing back to where it could be would be my top priority. Outside of that, we do absolutely have to focus on wellness because as Mr. Walker was testifying to, the PTSD rate of correctional officers or correctional staff is far above, even studies show even higher than military, because we're exposed to inmates or criminals who have been convicted day in and day out. None of them are happy to be in the location that they are. Not all of them, but a vast majority of them are not pleasant to deal with. And we deal with that 5 to 7 days a week, 8 to 16 hours a day, depending on. So if we can up our wellness programs and get it back to more of a family where we support each other outside of the pay and increasing the staffing, I think those are the biggest things on our plate right now.
Thank you. Both your comments and your reference to Mr. Walker is a good transition to my next question. It's first is a comment from Mr. Walker, and he can respond or not respond, your choice, because it's good to see you again. The comment is this: I love you, brother. Thank you for being here. But let me tee up my question, because I made reference earlier that my office does hear from officers in facilities throughout the state. Just most recently, within the last couple of weeks, FCI Victorville and FCI Mendota visited my office to highlight how staffing shortages have compromised their safety, with specific examples, impeded their ability to fulfill their responsibilities, and of course negatively impacts their lives outside of work. Not just inside of work, but outside of work, right? They describe the emotional toll and strains on family that it causes, especially when it comes to mandatory overtime. Imagine those who are trying to make sure their young children are taken care of. We give example after example. So to address the staffing shortages, in addition to pay, to your point, Mrs. White, the Bureau must support its corrections officers by ensuring they have that sufficient time off and provide them with the necessary mental health and wellness resources that they need. So, Mr. Walker, you described some personal experience with the committee earlier in your testimony. Whether it's specific to the back-to-back mandatory shifts or anything else, can you give other examples of how the staffing shortages impacts officers' lives and wellness, and what other suggestions you have for the Senate?
Wow, that's a lot. First off, thank you, Senator, and I love you too, sincerely. Thank you for your friendship. The problem of wellness within corrections is that they treat it like it's a one-off. This is not, it has to be something preventative, and it has to be comprehensive, ongoing, continuous, because the environment that you're steeped in every single day is relentless in its assault. As Ms. White testified to, prisons are not happy places. No one wants to be there. So the ability to mitigate, to address the impact that you're walking into a place where your hypervigilance is continuously activated, and the amount of dopamine and cortisol and epinephrine and everything else is continuously flooding you, and you have no idea that that's happening. There has to be an education process to help you understand and to help your family understand the ramifications of that, so that you can create the preventative measures internally, externally, and personally. Because there's no way you get away from it. And I know we're running over time, but there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done, and we can't simply believe it's the blue pill and that we're just going to keep on in the excitement of existence in the system.
Right. Mr. Chair, I know my time is up. I'll just end with this comment because based on Mr. Walker's response and for consideration of the panelists and this committee, what is PTSD when there is no P? That's what you just described. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Wow. Before I go to Mr. Welsh, I just want to warn Mr. Walker, given the power and potency of Senator Padilla's love, you've exceeded your amount of love you're allowed to receive in a Senate hearing. And for the sense of proportionality and balance, I just want to let all the other witnesses know that I love you as well. Senator Welsh.
I love you too. And it's nice to meet you. It's just a chill place when we got Senator Booker in charge, right? But you know what? I really do. We do appreciate you. I mean, it's incredible work you do. It's hard work and dangerous work at times. And so thank you. I want to express that gratitude to you. You know, I want to ask you, a couple of you, on the basis of your experience, something that's relevant to us in Vermont. We don't have a residential reentry facility. We're one of only 2 states. In fact, I think we're really the only one. Hawaii had one, and there were some issues there. They want to get another one. But, and I'm a former public defender, so I've dealt with a lot of people that you deal with after the court process. But I know, Mr. Wetzel, you've had a lot of experience with this in Pennsylvania. And I would like you to just explain why residential reentry programs are really beneficial for the criminal justice system, for public safety, and of course for the well-being of the person who's moving from the end of their sentence in the last 12 months to the community. Could you do that for us?
I could, and thank you. And I got to tell you, let me pander a little bit. In prepping and the work we're doing, really.
You know, my experience here, you don't get resistance on pandering from U.S. senators.
Well, I felt all the love in the room from the chairman, so I figured I'd share it myself. But I got to spend some time with your director, Nick Demmel.
Right.
And in several of your prisons, actually looking at national staffing with the Correctional Leaders Association. And I think if you'd ask him or ask anyone, imagine somebody being locked up for 1, 3, 5, 7 years, 10 years. Imagine just the amount of technology that's been developed to go from incarceration, and incarceration right now, and I keep looking back to these guys because it's never felt like this inside facilities before. I mean, 30 years, 35 years. You know, even systems that didn't put an emphasis on rehabilitation necessarily, there was a relationship. Like, it was relational between correctional staff and incarcerated people, and some of that modeling modified behavior. So on top of just the need to give people tools to adjust to society after being locked up, just decision making, right? You don't make decisions when you're incarcerated. You don't pick what to eat. So just kind of getting used to that in a world that's flying was always important. There are no services inside prisons. You don't have a 40% vacancy rate and think you're delivering high quality programming and preparing people to get out. So I mean, right now, I think it's even more important that you have these you guys call them residential reentry centers at the federal level, or halfway houses, where people can come up, first take a breath, right? Get out, get used to it, and then start plugging them into services. Like in Pennsylvania, we have a great career link network, right? That we can leverage off other systems from the state to get people and help people get back on their feet and become contributing members. So it's a really critical.
Thank you. And I'll ask you, Ms. Moore-White, as well, to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I have to second what he said. Typically in prison, you don't have a cell phone. We do. We now have tablets and stuff like that. But I can only imagine it is life-altering walking out of a prison into society today. And I flash back to Shawshank Redemption, and when they released the guy from prison or whatever, he truly, like, he asked his boss, "Can I go to the restroom, boss?" It's a different world, and so any transition time that they could have from prison until fully outside without supervision, I think is extremely helpful.
Okay. I thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'm very grateful. Ms. Nance, you have an interesting perspective that I think is really valuable that I'd like to pull out a little bit more. And I'd like to ask you the question of understanding what the inmates are going through and the lack of support from the understaffing. How does that affect, in your opinion, the preparedness of inmates to reenter society? Why is this conversation we're having so vital, not just for the inmates being released, but also the communities into which they're being released?
Thank you, Chair. I definitely want to echo everything that has been said amongst the other witnesses. I do think that there's a very high relationship that could happen when it comes to the people who are working in facilities and the incarcerated people. So I've seen personally, in my experience, the best outcome when those relationships are strong. So I talk a little bit about my loved one, but one of the things that's been very beneficial to him is when there is someone like a unit manager who is in his building that is trying to have their back and really trying to make sure that they do have access to the resources that they need. So for instance, even paperwork, like I've been trying to get this paperwork, get this request in so that I can go to the law library, and people aren't listening. They're not getting my paperwork. I'm trying to request medicine. There's a unit manager in my loved one's building that will say, "I got you." And it might take a week. It might take a couple weeks. It might take a few days, but she always gets back to them. And that really makes a difference. And I do know that he's told me that she suffers from burnout and depression because she might be one of the only people who's willing to go there and give her all, like 100% to her job, just because she cares about the human beings that are behind the walls. So it really does impact those individuals, because at the end of the day, like you said, 95, 90%, whatever that figure is, people are gonna come home. So the better we can make the environment for them, the better they're gonna be when they do reenter society.
So no, I really appreciate you testifying to really the fact that there are so many people that are working in corrections that are trying to do the right thing by their inmates but are unable because they're stressed out, they're overtaxed, they're unable to do the jobs that they were designed to do. But just to push a little bit more on the impact, not specifically your loved one individually, but on an issue I think Mr. Mangual explored really well in his testimony about this idea of recidivism rates and how high they are. Is it your experience that should inmates get the kind of resources they were intended to get, not just for the First Step Act, but even go back 10, 15 years ago, that these recidivism rates could come down?
Absolutely, Senator. I think what's really, really interesting about programming in prisons is it gets talked about in a way that feels very, very frequent, right? But what happens is there are people who have case plans. There are people who also have interests. So the more that we can connect them to things that are not necessarily them sitting inside a cell, the more likely they're going to be to have hope, to have morale, to be able to do something that's bigger than themselves and take their journey on rehabilitation. Like I heard Mr. Walker say that there was a time where people were really trying to do their job of rehabilitation and say, okay, this is what I'm doing when I go to work. And I do think that mentality could really have an impact on our system and have an impact on recidivism.
And what I've found, I think every human has found, that when you apply yourself to some task that demands discipline and hard work, and you begin to see the rewards of that, whether it's advancing in your own education or in programs that deal with alcohol and drug abuse, that sort of training you get from grit prepares you for other areas. And when you're denied choices or the opportunity to experience that, it has an impact on what your behavioral patterns will be when you're released from incarceration, correct?
Absolutely. So I would say that even as a human being, like all of us, we've all experienced accomplishments. We've all experienced what that looks like to be able to say, I did it. Like that pushes you forward. That makes you a better person. That makes you a more productive member of society. That makes you better in yourself. And that is no different for incarcerated people. And they need to have that opportunity to be able to do that and feel accomplished and be better for when they come home.
Right, and I live in a community that I would consider being over incarceration, but I talk to young men that come home, and if they haven't had exposure to opportunities to develop these skills, and often felt like they were treated like an animal inside, that when they come back out, you often see them not able to rehabilitate and going back to the same kind of patterns. And often coming with mental health conditions and others that were worsened while they were there. That really has an impact on the safety of communities. Would you agree?
Absolutely, Senator. There's so big of a hole in mental health resources behind the walls. And my personal therapist, she'll say, does he have access to mental health services? And I'm like, no, he does not. But I do think that really trying to shift that mindset from behind the walls and really being able to communicate with people in a way that is not an institutionalized mindset would definitely prepare them for re-entering society.
And so when I was mayor of the city of Newark and I started seeing the recidivism rates, I knew that I could lower my crime rates in my community if I could do something to lower those recidivism rates. And we did a lot of things in partnership with the Manhattan Institute, which was actually one of my best allies when I was mayor, and setting up programs to attack what I thought was one of the sources of crimes, is these populations coming out of prison that were not prepared to reintegrate. Mr. Walker and Ms. White, my heart is really heavy about knowing what correctional officers face every single day. I thought the wise comment, he shouldn't just come in here and drop wisdom and then just walk out like that. But Senator Padilla, who talked about PTSD, not PTSD, the P is really not there. And I love, one of my best experiences as mayor was working with law enforcement and seeing the trials and tribulations of my police officers, but yet they're also in environments where they get to be a hero, they get the approbation of communities, they get the support. But I look at my correctional officers, and they're not in those kind of environments, and they don't have the same unimaginable stressors. It's just a disproportionate amount of that. And Mr. Walker, before I get to Ms. White, I think you can speak to that in a personal way about us as a society creating these institutions that put so much stress and strain on the correctional officers themselves, and not only don't support our correctional officers, but put them in environments where there hasn't been increased deterioration of their well-being and what the consequences of that are. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that for me.
Mr. Chair, yes. Look, these systems were designed to punish people. And the byproduct of it, of the not fully continuing to consider it, is that the people that you put into that environment are also being traumatized. They are experiencing traumatic incidents every day. And there's nothing in the hiring description or the job description that forewarns you of what you're going to experience and how to not vicariously pass that on to your loved ones, to your children, because the thing that I'm willing to bet you any one of these officers sitting behind me or Miss White will tell you that their significant other has told them at some point is, don't talk to me like I'm an inmate. Because we flip this switch when we walk into this environment, and it's not that anybody ever tells you that you have to do it. It's so ingrained in the culture and the institution that you pick it up as a survival mechanism. It's a human. It's one of the traits of.
So under normal circumstances, Mr. Walker, we should be doing more for the mental health and well-being of our correctional officers, but that the added stressor of understaffing, to me, and again, I talked to a lot of the Capitol Police officers when we had our worst period post January 6th, where officers were being held over again and again, and I would talk to parents and things I didn't even think through, not as a parent myself, about what kind of chaos it throws your family into.
Yes.
So now you have the stressors of the job plus the stressors of understaffing and what that means. It just seems to me almost like you're throwing your correctional officers into a kind of punishment prison environment in and of itself.
Yes.
Not to mention then being underpaid and feeling the financial strains.
And the lack of public appreciation is not the appropriate word, because nobody's doing it for the pat on the back, but there's this stigma attached to being a correctional officer. And people just don't look at the job as something of value to society.
And so you said something, Mrs. White, in your testimony, and I put it in quotes here because I just wanted to come back to you on it. You talked about upping our wellness programs.
Correct.
I really, and I've talked to FOP, I've talked to a lot of law enforcement organizations because they're all concerned about suicide rates in law enforcement in general. And I don't think Americans fully understand what, from our Border Patrol agents all the way to our correctional officers, what it means to do this work. But I just want that up our wellness programs. I just want you to flesh that out. Like, what would you want from Congress if you had a chance to help mandate when it comes to that kind of wellness? What would you tell us to do? Because I know in the last panel I could see it in a bipartisan way, it affecting people when they started hearing these issues of mental health for our correctional officers.
Sure. I think the list is extremely lengthy. Something that I didn't get to hit on with Mr. Padilla that I think also would increase wellness and staff morale is support from the top of our agency. We hear a lot of policy changes, and you got to get this, and you got to get that, and we're so busy dotting our I's and crossing our T's with paperwork that we don't truly see the human aspect anymore. And that's what I was trying to hit on. 20 years ago, it felt more like a family. We had bonfires together. We would go get a drink together or hang out. For birthdays, we would, I started in health services. We would take an after-hours trip and go to a restaurant and celebrate. And anymore, people are so burned out that they don't even do that. My husband is a former combat veteran and correctional officer. So we, just activities outside of our house, we don't typically do because of the PTSD and the stress and the things that we take home. I think there's a ton of things, exercise programs. I think that exploring additional activities, because we get so locked into our careers and what we do that we don't. If you ask me right now what I enjoy doing outside of here, I do union stuff 24/7. I don't have an activity that I could tell you I enjoy. I think those things are essential to helping the wellness of our staff. And as Mr. Walker had said, actually identifying that we're under stress is a huge thing. A lot of our officers are assaulted and they want to go straight back to post because that's who we are. We don't want to accept that we have been harmed in any way, that we may need to decompress and take a moment. That's huge in corrections. We have to prove that we are big and bad and somebody, and so we walk back into a place where we just got assaulted from. I think things of that nature are detrimental to us. I think that we have to be able to identify first that we're under stress, and we're not good at that. But then offer programs. The Bureau offers something called EAP, Employee Assistance Program. You can call. You get like 6 free sessions a year, but the stigma behind actually utilizing that service is horrendous, and so our employees will not do that.
So I hope you'll work with my staff. We're
Absolutely.
trying to look across the law enforcement about how can we start emphasizing mental health.
Absolutely.
I just want to pull this out because my staff really thought it was an important point. 7 years ago, I guess we did a hiring freeze.
Yes.
And it was almost like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Absolutely.
Could you explain that for the record?
Sure. So 2016, we had a lot of vacant positions. I think that was kind of the start of what I call the perfect storm. 20 years ago, people were knocking down the door to come to the Bureau of Prisons. It was a great salary. I doubled my salary. I was a pharmacy technician prior to coming into the prison. I applied 3 different times. People were knocking down the door to get into our agency. The pay and the benefits were phenomenal. You didn't really think about like Mr. Walker said, you don't really read and know the mental toll that it will take on you. It was the pay and the benefits that was the pull to coming in. And I totally lost my train of thought. Tell me your question again. No. I'm so sorry.
What happened 7 years ago that was the straw that broke the camel's back?
It was unspoken. We had 6,000 or 7,000 vacant positions, and the agency was unofficially told to freeze them. Right. And from that point, the agency has shuffled and juggled numbers and percentages to the point that it wasn't a true, we're not hiring, it wasn't a true cutoff, but they weren't hiring. And so even because they weren't hiring, and then through attrition, we lost even more individuals. And I can't tell you that it's the agency or DOJ or who. We, for many years, have tried to pull out where these freezes are coming from, but it is detrimental, and that was the start. 2016 was the start of the downfall. I came in 2004. 2003, we had a legal decision we call mission critical, and prior to me coming, my home institution, Forest City, Arkansas, we had 4 people on the compound to basically just monitor and run the compound and the traffic. We now, on a good day, have 2 individuals to do that. They called it mission critical, and they cut a lot of positions. And then the 2016, they froze all the positions. And so it has just been a constant decline from that point. And so that's what I was telling, I think Senator Ossoff as far as when when the council goes out and meets with congressional officials, we have asked for staffing, we have asked for pay, we have asked for a lot of things, but we have tried to hone in because while every year we've been successful in getting additional pay and stuff like that, we have not truly been successful in getting additional officers added, even though the number is 20,446 and we set around 12,000 officers.
Can you just inform the floor if I'm not necessary for this vote, they can close the vote out? Okay. I'm just being pushed because there's a floor vote going on right now, but if I'm not essential for it, I want to stay on point because we have this extraordinary opportunity to flesh some of this out. And so that seemed in the previous panel this afternoon to Mr. Wetzel, the problem that I saw is there's just no way to catch up when the competition for people who are willing to do this kind of work is so fierce. And I want you to flesh that out for me, because she's saying I'm trying to hire people when I'm offering them less pay, more difficult working conditions and hours. I mean, who would choose this job if I could work in state corrections, county corrections? In the free market, we're in a high labor demand market. There's just no way out of this hole unless Congress does something to create financial incentives. Am I wrong or am I right?
No, you're 100% right. And plus, you don't even have the agility to be competitive in a market where you're competing with everyone. So what's left is folks who, 5 to 15 year. So you're in so long you can't get out. I mean, one of the things that is a cautionary tale that should scare us to death is the retention rate of new people coming into corrections. I saw reported in Pennsylvania Department of Corrections budget hearing, 37% within 18 months. There's systems that have about a 20% retention rate year one. So what that signals is that, look, when you're in it at some period of time, it's all you know. You talk about rallying. Sadly for us, it's the get or done kind of mentality means we're going to get it done, and the folks who are in are going to stay in. It's running new people out because when you have no point of reference and you go through training and you hear this aspirational stuff and you look at this generation who wants to be mission driven and you come in and there's supposed to be 2 people working with you and you're by yourself and it doesn't recognize anything and you can make the same amount of money across the street, it's not going to happen.
And so you're one of the people I look to and I have a ton of respect for because I think you have a view of the sort of correctional complex in the country. There's no way out of this trap. You can just give me a yes or no. There's no way out of this trap we're in right now unless we find ways to make a more financially attractive career, not job, a career path for people who are thinking about going into corrections. Is that correct, yes?
No, actually, you can't throw money at it. That's not going to fix it.
Okay.
You have to fundamentally change the work conditions. Yeah, if this was a warehouse, you won't work in a warehouse where you have a chance of getting stabbed every day.
Right.
And if you can work at a warehouse and make less and you're not invested in the pension and the kind of stuff, why wouldn't you?
Right.
We have to there's no, when you look at the state employers and state prison systems are 2 or 3 employer. Add county jails, you're talking about huge numbers of correctional officers around the country, right? So you would think there'd be career concentrations in corrections. You would think academia. We need other sectors to pay attention. We need strategies for other sectors that have worked in this crisis. We can't keep, this is like Henry Ford saying, if I asked what they need, they would have said build faster horses. We're well beyond, you can't throw money at a situation.
Right.
How much can I pay you to go risk your life?
Right. Now that's wise, and I see Mr. Walker, Mrs. White, just shaking their heads up and down and smiling like.
In any other world, it wouldn't even be a question. Right. Just in corrections, all of a sudden we think we apply different rules that defy logic anywhere else in the world, and then we expect good outcomes from that. It defies logic, even more than most things in this building do.
Okay.
Sorry.
I want to get into 2 more things real quick. There was a lot of, the Inspector General was talking about contraband being snuck into prisons, the danger of telephones in prisons and more. And I figure it would be nice to ask people who actually have been correctional officers about how do you stop contraband coming into prisons? Because I think that was something else that I think people left thinking about, well, if we just make it a felony and not a misdemeanor, and some quick answers and solutions. But I think you all probably have some wisdom on this How do you stop this contraband that endangers officers as well? How do you stop the contraband from coming into prisons? I'm going to allow it a jump ball.
You want I can start.
Yeah.
More equipment, more staff are definitely helpful.
More equipment, meaning screeners and...
Not necessarily. So Senator Cotton is on like a cell phone jamming bill.
Yes.
That's super helpful. If we could jam the signal to the cell phones and the drones that are dropping drugs into our prison, that's incredibly helpful. There is technology out there. It is costly.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Mr. Walker, did you have something to add?
Creating penalties for it is not the answer. Look, I'm sitting in a cell, and I know that it's illegal, and I'm going to do it anyway because I have a need. So I think that's part of the thought process, or the thought exercise that has to take place is not the illegal part, obviously, but the part where the guy just needs a cell phone so he can stay in contact with his family, his friend. So the need part undercuts some of that contraband introduction into the system. Specifically in the area of cell phones. I think the tablets, like California, we're doing the tablets now. So so that communication of being able to talk with your children, talk to your loved one, that's cutting down some of that. The blockers, it's not a blocker, but it's an authorization process. So it's tracking everything. And someone mentioned it in the hearing this morning, is that they can track every call that's made in and around the state prison.
Two things. One is the rates at which, the cost at which to make these calls, the difficulty it is to communicate your family. If you create ease of communication, the pressure for people getting phones for that. And those who want those phones to continue to do illegal activity outside, though, that's where the equipment that you're talking about is more helpful. That's really helpful. I don't know if...
Let me just add this. Any other sector, you'd say technology. For the military, you'd R&D, and you'd have this stuff that didn't require staff. Our answers in corrections, again, we want to throw staff at it, or we want to lock more people up that we don't have the resources to manage anyhow.
Right.
So all our discussion is around the two things we cannot do. We have to pull from other sectors. It's technology, it's creativity, it's academia, and it's bright young minds coming in the field and thinking differently.
I'm grateful you said that. Just, Mr. Wessel, I want to stay on you. There are thousands of released folks on home confinement. Their recidivism rates are dramatically low. If they're compliant right now, is there any reason to bring them back in?
Absolutely not. At a hearing about staffing and a 40% vacancy rate, that should be criminal if you're going to bring somebody back who's not committing a crime.
Okay. Before I close out, Mr. Mangal, because I just love and respect the academic work you do and the studies you do, and you said something that I maybe want to have a hearing on, and it's a bipartisan bill that I have called the Victim Act, because in communities like mine, the closeout rates for serious violent crime is so low, and there's a great researcher that I read back in my mayoral days who said inner city communities often have too much law enforcement that they don't need, which is low-level drug crimes, and not enough law enforcement that they do need. And so our bill, the Victim Act, is to try to get a lot more resources to close out those serious violent crimes, which the closeout rates are so low, really affirming, which my experience really was in line with what you said, that the number of people committing my crimes when I was mayor were just a small group of individuals who, when I first became mayor, our closeout rate on murders was like 20%. I used to joke that this is the best place in America to kill somebody because it's so unlikely that you'll get caught. Would you affirm the part of what I just said that like something has to be done in getting law enforcement the resources they need to focus on the criminals that are at the center of a lot of the larger, more serious crimes?
Absolutely, but I do think it's important to recognize that there is a lot of overlap between offenders who commit the most serious crimes and offenders who commit some of the lower level crimes. And one of the most interesting statistics out of the early 1990s in New York, when then Chief Bratton of the Transit Police Department in 1990 started a big fare evasion program, right? And I think people rightly think of fare evasion as a relatively low level offense. Two statistics that came out of that enforcement program, I think really shocked a lot of people and created a lot of support for the kind of broken window strategy that caught hold after that. And one was that somewhere around 1 in 20 of the individuals who were arrested for evading the fare had an illegal weapon on them. And something like 1 in 7 were found to have an outstanding felony warrant, which is, two pretty significant figures. And what that tells us is that most criminals don't specialize. I think the research makes this pretty clear, which means that tomorrow's shooter can be yesterday's retail thief, can be, next week's car thief, et cetera. So I wouldn't necessarily sort of push the paradigm that, the only way to sort of solve the more serious crimes is to abandon enforcement on the lower level stuff. I think it's important to put ourselves in a situation in which we can do both. And one of the things that, is very clear, and there's great research by Anthony Braga, who's a professor now at the University of Pennsylvania, which is developing into one of the best criminology departments in the country, frankly, looking at clearance rates for non-fatal shootings, because we see so many resources get diverted into homicide investigations, which understandably so. Non-fatal shootings, which are the only difference between a fatal shooting and a non-fatal shooting, is usually aim and chance. They don't get as many resources. And when you increase those resources, when you put the same amount of time in, what you found is that you can increase the clearance rate. But all of that really comes down to a question of resources. And like I said during my testimony, writ large, across the board, the criminal justice systems throughout this country are underfunded on so many counts. A lot of the bad results that we see and that we want to improve are simply a function of our inability to correctly staff, to have morale, to have high-quality individuals taking these positions and dedicating themselves and doing them well. And part of that is, creating pay parity. Part of that is having incentives, promotional ceilings being raised and giving people a sense of ownership and pride in the work that they do. But really, it's just a function of building out that infrastructure. So many departments, police departments, correctional departments are working off technology that's 30, 40 years old. There are no data scientists within these institutions doing the kinds of analysis to inform the deployment of resources in any kind of strategic way.
There's enough head nodding on this committee as you're talking that you're getting a lot of affirmation. I want to just sort of end on this because when you fairly talked about the First Step Act and the analysis we have so far is only a shorter period of time. It's not that 8-year window you were discussing. But I guess what frustrates me, not with anything you said, but just frustrates me in general, is what I started seeing when I was mayor, which was when we were punishing, thought we were better punishing inmates by taking away Pell Grants and all of these things, when all the data showed $1 invested in allowing somebody a pathway, people coming out with BAs or MAs have dramatically lower rates. And I don't remember the exact data point, but it was something like every dollar spent in education programs paid for itself, returned to the taxpayer in terms of just the reduced recidivism rates. And so to have a First Step Act that, as Senator Whitehouse said so passionately, that is not being done because we don't have the staff to do it. This is something good to pursue because the data you're talking about, recidivism, would go down even further if there was actually access to the programs that were articulated by the 86 members of the Senate that voted for that act. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I think that's certainly the hope, but it's hard to know if we don't have the resources to properly implement these things. I mean, one of the most staggering statistics that came out of the last year annual report on the First Step Act was that about 29,000 individuals had been released as a result of the First Step Act. And if you look at the breakdown of individuals who had received any of the evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, about 14,000, almost half, hadn't received any programs. Now, a big part of that was because a good chunk of that number never actually entered a BOP facility, but also partly because they just received lower sentences. But being able to faithfully implement these things, they take time, they take resources. If you don't have those, you simply can't actually flesh out the plan to any level where we can say with any kind of scientific certainty whether it works.
Mr. Mongwell, you and I are going to agree there, and I'm going to professionalize saying your name correctly. I just want to say a few points before we close, because I have seen how, and this goes to the point we're talking about, how when a kid gets caught up in the system early, it actually can create cycles of criminality because of the experiences they have in the criminal justice system. And, you know, there's the very famous cases like Khalif Browder and others where he was accused of stealing a backpack, waited for 2 years before being even adjudicated. My first time I went to Rikers with Jared Kushner's father, Charlie Kushner, I asked the kids how long they'd been incarcerated, and they were like, 6 months, 8 months, a year. And I said, well, what have you been convicted of? And they hadn't been convicted. And many of them had spent time in solitary confinement. And the difference between that experience and the experience where I grew up in an affluent neighborhood where kids who would often do the same kind of things would have station house adjustments and never enter a system that traumatized them in the first place. And so this idea that we create low-level penalties, and I struggled with this when I was mayor, that when we started saying we're not going to ignore, and this idea of ignoring crimes, if there's no accountability, then you're inviting the thing to continue. It's just like common sense, right? So we said this open-air drinking, which was the biggest complaints I got from citizens in my community, we were going to start to talk. We weren't going to take people to prison. We weren't going to give them the kind of ticket that would create a poverty trap. And we did find people that had illegal possession of firearms and the like. So I'm not disagreeing with that. But what I'm disagreeing with in terms of policy is creating a system that takes our children into the system, traumatizes them, they come back out, they start falling further and further behind in school or what have you. We have to find a way to create a system that reflects the best of our values. And it starts with supporting the professionals that are a part of doing a job. Ms. White, when you talked about the mission of corrections, it is not just punishment. It is not. No correctional officer will say that. So much about it is this understanding that we are a society that believes in rehabilitation, that believes in redemption, and creating systems that promote and support that, which ultimately do inure to public safety. I am really grateful for this panel and for you all allowing this engagement. I'm grateful for my ranking member, who I have a lot of respect for, because I know he's seeking the same ends that I am in our society, safe, strong communities. I'm really happy that my friends like Senator Padilla talked about love, because we're ultimately trying to create a more beloved community here in our country. And today in the United States Senate, the five of you have really brought, I think, the best of not just testimony, the best of heart and intention to help us to solve very, very difficult problems. I've learned a lot from you, and I know that the record will reflect, I hope, the makings of some bipartisan ideas to really advance it, including the bill that we're looking at now as a result of this morning's hearing, which is Ranking Member Cotton's bill, directly to your idea of creating better equipment. Thank you, everybody, for your time, for your testimony. I know there's some official closing remarks I'm supposed to make, and I know the word love is not in them. Let me see, closing, here it goes. Thank you to our ranking member, Senator Cotton. I think I've done that already, yes, sufficiently. Thank you to each of our subcommittee members who are not here to hear this. Special thank you to our witnesses. I think I've given you a special thank you. Federal and state prisons are suffering from overstaffing. There's language that reflects what I've already said. This is the stuff I have to say. I want to remind the members of the subcommittee that questions for the record are due a week from today, Wednesday, a week from today at 5 p.m., and I ask that the witnesses, and I know as busy as you are, as understaffed and undersupported as you are, might be in your job, please respond to those questions in a timely manner. They will be more helpful than you know from a committee that really wants to do some substantive work in this area. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. I'm grateful.